Welcome to Phantom Astronaut. I'd like to thank all of the Phantom Astronaut patrons for supporting the show. If you enjoy the podcast and would like to support the show, visit phantomastronaut.com for all the different ways that you can help us continue to create. Today, I'm speaking with Will Barrett, PhD, about social class and outcomes on college campuses. Hi, Will. Thanks for joining me today.
Well, thanks for inviting me. This is going to be fun.
So the thing that we want to cover, or at least spend the most time covering today, is probably going to be your focus, research, concentration on some of these social outcomes hard outcomes that come from like social class disparity on college campuses. And I know you've done some research into that. But before we get into that, why don't you tell the audience a little bit about who you are, what your background is, and what you're currently up to?
I'll go fairly deep background because it does segue into my current peculiar lifestyle. I grew up in a college town, so college is kind of what I know. Most of my friends were fathers or mothers were on the faculty. Going to college was a confirming experience. The world worked the way I thought it worked. Since then, I was a professor at Indiana State University, which I enjoyed very much in higher education leadership, an emphasis in student affairs. I was there for about 30 years, which I liked very much. I liked that campus because a lot of the students were themselves first generation. That means neither mom nor dad, or if they were a single parent or aunts or uncles, had experience in college, which makes it particularly difficult. Great students, loved it immensely. During that time, my wife got a Fulbright to Budapest. So we spent a year living in Buda, sometime in Pest. We enjoyed it immensely. Got this idea that living outside the United States provided interesting insights. 7 years later, she got a Fulbright I'm trying to think of where I am. Beijing. Thank you. And that was a weird and wonderful experience. We lived on a campus. In those days, everyone worked for what was called a Danwei. You worked and lived on a campus or factory grounds. So pretty much everything was all on campus. And again, it's Beijing. Very, very interesting. Well, life went forward. We retired from Indiana State early, moved to Rayat, Thailand, which is upcountry. So if you look at a map, it's between the N and the D over near Laos and Cambodia. Loved that, taught there for 3 years. And then I got a Fulbright to University of Malaya. And we loved the city so much we stayed. Had to leave for COVID, went back. And since that time, we have been essentially nomadic. If you're nomadic or if you travel much, you begin to understand the differences that are important in the world. But my life has been almost from start to finish on campus. Even while we were living in Beijing or Rayat, Thailand, we were doing workshops at nearby campuses. So one of the things that I became really interested in quite some time ago was how social class kind of works out on campus, because it's fairly complex. It's a fairly complex issue. People often think, lower class, working class, upper class. Well, it's not quite that simple. There's not fine distinctions between each. And what do you mean by class anyway? So I started to read and write and present at conferences around social class issues on campus, social class identity. And wouldn't you know it, some other people began to read my stuff and wrote better and fuller stuff. And so I go to conferences, and it's so much fun to see the people who've kind of taken the base work that I've done and gone way, 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 way beyond it. So what I really talked about was we all have a social class of origin where we grew up. We learned what we were, what we weren't. Like having a gender of origin, we learned what we were and what we weren't. We have a current felt social class. I'm pretty much the same in terms of my social class of origin. My father was a professor, my sister's a professor, my wife's a professor, and my current felt social class. And the third part, we have this attributed social class, what other people think of us. That's kind of in our control, but not always. Depends on how we perform social class. How do you dress? How do you talk? What do you eat? How do you eat? Et cetera, et cetera. These are all fairly complex issues. But so think of somebody who grew up a good family, working class family, but no parents, aunts, uncles have any experience in education. They learned their social class of origin. Then they go to campus and all of a sudden take on characteristics of who they weren't. So it's a very interesting social class transformation. I know transgendering is an incredibly complex and important issue now. It's not nearly as dangerous, transforming yourself in terms of some social class, but many of the same issues are there. Internalized self-hate, self-doubt, imposter syndrome, and those kinds of things. But for someone like me coming to campus is not a conversion experience, it's a confirmation experience. This is the way I think the world should be. And it took me a long time to get away from that. Given kind of my family's business, my sister was in management and on campus, chairman and dean and director and all of those things, which is right in the thick of what I call the ruling class. They make and enforce the rules. And, I may be one of the few people talking about it in that way, but that's okay. I think the more complex ways and the more different ways people talk about social class lends to the more clarity and more complexity in understanding it in our lives. If you look at, let's take, for example, beer. I don't drink a lot of beer, but I drink very odd beers. Budweiser, Anheuser-Busch, InBev, all have social class market segmented beers. Low cost to, imported beers. InBev, the corporation that owns a lot of that stuff, is European. So basically all their beers are imported beers, but we won't talk about that. But they market their beers very, very differently depending on whether you're trying to sell Bud Light or Michelob or Amstel or whatever else. You even look at drug addiction. Drug addiction is often thought to be, accurately or not, social class market segmented, that poor people use X drugs, rich people use Y drugs. I don't know that that's particularly true, but this is the idea culturally that we have. Traveling, go ahead, please.
Oh, I was going to say that I think that even without any kind of hard analytical research into this, just me as a layman hearing you speak, there's things that sort of ring true just on a gut level, right? So one thing that I'm very familiar with is the term code switching. So for the audience, if you're not familiar with that term, it typically refers to changing the way that you sort of speak or present, typically in the context of the United States, broken down by sort of ethnic demographics, and that ties in, of course, also with social class dynamics as well. So let's say that I've heard this a lot from friends of mine who are people of color, and what they'll say is, they speak differently when they're in the office than they do with their family. They don't speak in the same kind of colloquial terms. They adopt what they consider to be a more white way of presenting, whether that's really, a white way of presenting, or if it's, just a series of changes to conform to sort of the corporate identity. I mean, there's so many different ways to break down, what is defined as white, but the way they're defining it when they speak to me is that they speak more in what they consider to be a white vernacular when they're in those sort of professional environments. Now, that, is something that's prevalent enough that I believe NPR even now has a program for the last couple of years called Code Switch. So the term, and at least, what the term signifies, really speaks to a broad cross-section of people. From my own experiences, I have noticed that there are breakdowns similar to what you talked about beer in the art world. And a lot of what we do here on the podcast is, we talk with artists and people who make art, and we talk about art. And on Threads, which is where Will, you and I think met initially, there are a lot of discussions, pretty heated ones, about, what is art, what is not art. And not all of it is really high-minded. And what I've noticed is that these conversations break down often by social class, and sometimes what you said as social class of origin. And I've noticed that there's a big pushback between people who exist in sort of the the I hate using these terms, but like sort of the more cloistered or elite levels of art that are typically tied to big institutions, museums, academia, things like that. And the things that are accepted there, like conceptual things, ready-mades and other, types of performance art and, everything that, that's been really considered dominant over maybe the last 50 years in art as big movements is really not considered to be art by many of the people who are younger people who are like, they draw in more of like a comic book illustration style, and they really think of art as representational painting. They don't think of it, in the same kind of like visual philosophical terms that people who come out of a more moneyed class and kind of commingled with an academic class think of it. So I see these things playing out constantly, the class divides and miscommunications and everything back and forth on it. So I feel definitely what you're speaking about has so many real world implications for, almost every field and interaction that we have.
And I think you should see the smile on my face at this moment, because that's, you've bang on, got to the heart of it. So much of this is not research based. I mean, empirically, I can tell you the census data and how the 20% income groups, but class is, you get to define it in your way, in your world. I get to define it in my way, in my world, from my perceptions. So when you're talking about art, I when I was coming up as a kid, there was high art and low art. I mean, God, just think about that language that, the Thor comics I was reading were, that's low art. That's not even art, et cetera, et cetera. Banksy, which is, he's one of my favorite artists for many reasons. I mean, is this incredible social commentator, and remaining mysterious in this day and age is itself a work of performance art, et cetera, et cetera. But I think you're bang on correct. There is high art. If you're going to get wealthy, you're going to have art at home, but is it going to come from the old masters section at Sotheby's, or is it going to come from, some seaside painter who's got just lovely, lovely talent? So I think almost any arena of human activity, there's going to be a social class overlay. It may not be, the social class overlay may not be primary, but it's always there. So when you go out to the desert to camp, are there prestige places to go? If you look around in the campground, are there differences in the vehicles that people bring, the tents that people use, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera? This gets me to another point. People often think that social class has to do with money. Well, kind of, but again, that's a perception that people have. Bordeaux, a French sociologist, said, okay, there's economic capital, as Marx talked about, but there's also social capital. It's not who you know, it's who knows you. It's a network of relationships of people. That's one of the things I find lovely about social media, and particularly threads. There is cultural capital, which is the knowledge and skills of the prestige class. Do you know the right fork to use, et cetera, the language to use? So when you get to translanguaging, code switching. My wife is a linguist, so when I hear code switching, I hear translanguaging. They're different. So I'll go with your code switching. Is there dining code switching behaviors? When you eat here, you're using, the 9 forks and 6 spoons, or are you just eating with one? Are there different ways to perform? Cultural capital. Bordeaux was talking about the cultural capital, knowledge and skills of the upper classes. I would argue that every class group, however you want to bunch them together, has its own knowledge and skills. You would talk about fishing. Well, deep sea fishing may be an upscale sport, but by and large, river fishing, pond fishing is a downscale sport. So is that cultural capital for whom, and how do you use that? So I think you just hit your finger, pointed your nose at the exact proper thing to begin to bring class into the analysis of discussions of art. What is art?
Mm-hmm. There's also
that. I love that sound. I mean, I'm an old teacher. When I hear a student go, Good. Yeah. This is a moment.
No, it is.
What,
This
what,
is a great conversation. I'm glad that we're able to have it, because something that you spoke about a second ago, the thing that actually made me go like, was related to when you said it's not necessarily monetary. And I also very strongly believe that. There's a friend of mine who he does a lot of punch ups on scripts, he's a script doctor, and, writes a little bit of his own stuff. And we sort of run in the same circles, but, he's, he doesn't have a tremendous amount of money. He lives sort of a monastic lifestyle, and that's in many ways by choice. He, he just disengages from those aspects of society. And I have not had an office job in a very long time. So the last office job that I had, I was an executive at this production company here in LA. We've done some fairly big movies and stuff like that. And I was trying to explain to him, because he goes, "Oh man, you were making so much money when you were at that place." And I said to him, I go, "Yeah, but I mean, I wasn't living how you would expect, somebody to be making that kind of money, because I was expected to have a certain kind of car. I was expected to have a certain kind of wardrobe. I was expected to be able to have enough disposable income from whatever they're paying me or however I'm getting it, to be able to cover, like, let's say that they send me to New York to do something, my meals, my airplane, my hotel, all of this stuff that would be, a major vacation for a family. I'm expected to absorb those costs, then write an expense report, and then eventually be reimbursed for the costs of that travel. And I may have to do that 3 or 4 times a month. So, when you start looking at what the salary rate is versus how much you're actually spending to participate and perform in that profession, the delta doesn't always look the same as you might expect for the amount of money that you're bringing in. And he was flabbergasted when I told him this. He goes, "What do you mean they're telling you what kind of car you have to drive?" And I said, "Well, they would bring over a note and they'd say to people at the office, they go, 'Hey, we share a building with, this big agency, and we don't want people to have an impression of our company that we're not paying people with. So maybe you might want to go get a different car.'" It was just very strongly implied. It wasn't like a policy where they said you have to have this car, but, you were definitely given social clues and signals that, you're not spending enough money, or presenting yourself as if you spend enough money, to participate in the organization at the level that you're at. So I think that there's a lot of stuff to be said about how social class rules are enforced.
Often very, very subtly. So what you're talking about is the kind of thing I describe as attributed social class. I see you and your car and your watch and your shoes and the quality of the cloth in your shirt, which it turns out is incredibly important for men. And I'm going to I'm going to say, "Oh, this person is rich, therefore upper class, therefore someone I need to pay attention to and respect." So there is advantages to presenting a certain social class profile. But let's talk. I'm an old hippie from way back. Let's talk about anti-class. These are people who have the same values often as the upper middle class, college educated, graduate educated, but have decided that they don't want the Rolex and BMW lifestyle. In fact, kind of toning down their performance in class, down being down class. So, driving a Volkswagen or whatever. And they're very much anti-establishment cars. Can you think of some brands that are essentially nice cars, but anti-establishment? Begins with S, ends with Uberu. Subaru is just a fabulous car. I like them immensely. Toyota's great cars, but they're kind of anti-class. The other people who are driving a Lexus or an Audi or a Beamer or whatever spend twice as much money for, pretty much the same car. So the performance of class is interesting. I know even in the media, individuals who are anti-class are valued in interesting ways. But yeah, I get what you're saying. My daughter's a lawyer with big law, and the good news is she works from home. So she goes to New York a couple times a year on their dime, but no, on her charge card, and then files for getting the money back that she's already spent. The assumption is she's got, 10 or 20K in disposable income just sitting there in a bank account. Nice thing to have. So the performance of class is basic to corporate image. You don't fit our image. Even in hiring, you don't fit our image. I've had a full beard since I was 26. I just gave up shaving. I just hate to shave. For many campuses, a bearded man is not part of their image. Now we move forward, and yes, you look up professor, and it's basically got my picture: old, mildly overweight, smiling, bespectacled, bearded guy with, I got my Santa Claus beard. So at different points in time, at different contexts, the class, or what is considered to be upper class, changes. So, all of a sudden Hollywood may turn around and decide, oh, we're all going to be eco-friendly. I wouldn't put it past them. And then, step up to expensive eco-friendly SUVs or whatever they decide to do. But I think you're bang on correct, talking about, the performance of self in everyday life. You're talking about the art and its meaning. There's always a class layer that's interesting. Let me go to when I lived in Beijing in 1995, 1996. Still a growing society. It's still a growing society, but there were very clearly class differences that were observable. We're in Beijing, so there's a fair military presence because that's where the goodies are handed out or whatnot. And the officers or high officers would often have some very nice pens in their pocket. I mean, not quite Mont Blanc, but, quite nice. And their driver would be driving a Western car, not something that was locally made. So you'd see a broken down Cadillac on the side of the road with some poor Chinese private trying to get it going, and some general staying there with their briefcase and just fuming. This is before cell phones, but it was just hysterical. But everywhere I have been, there are social class markers that are very, very obvious, whether it's dress or the number of pens you have or the kind of phone you have. Let's talk about Android versus iPhone, which is higher class.
Yeah. Oh, I mean, I've been told that iPhone is higher class, but I've never cared for it personally. But I kind of buck that tradition a little bit. But yes, across the board, there was an article that came out. I don't know if it was research based or gut feeling. I forget where it was published, but it was something about dating and iPhones, and if they're texting, the guy, the girl, whoever, and they're texting each other, and you can't use certain emojis or something that you can use on iPhone, then they won't even go on the date because they're like, oh, that person's using an Android, and I think that, if they have an Android, then they're not going to be able to take me to a fancy date, and they just stop talking to them.
Yes. Those stories are endless. I just get a giggle out of iPhone users. I know a lot of them. I have some in my family, and we do not speak of this. But yeah, it's very real. I mean, I'm going with the phone company that will let me use my phone anywhere on the planet. iPhone doesn't do that.
Right.
So, put in my plug for my phone company or not. But yet, this is when you begin to look at things like, phones and cars and drug addiction. Alcoholism, the great thing is, runs across the spectrum. I mean, the Betty Ford Clinic, are you kidding? The wife of the president of the United States had her own clinic. Alcoholism is a terrible, terrible problem, but runs across social classes. Cocaine is different, perhaps because of the cost. Crack is different, perhaps because of the cost. If you look at prescription drugs, they're abused by a certain market segment in the United States. So again, you start to look at, alcohol, drugs, dress. One of my students, I love working with students because they always see stuff that you don't. They're always terribly clever. Talked about obviously labeled fashion.
Yeah.
So if you're going to go out and buy a handbag or a jacket or a briefcase or whatever one would buy, finding a nice one that does not have, Coco Chanel's label or YSL or whatever is very difficult. So in many ways, people buy those as a mark of their social status, kind of related to social class, but social status and class are very, very similar. But yeah, if you look at who has got branded, obviously labeled fashion that tells you something about them, they're often letting the world tell them what is class and what is not, rather than looking themselves
absolutely.
for a bespoke purse or something else.
Absolutely. But even within that, there's also sort of stratifications, because especially in a capitalist society, there's going to be always more opportunities to extract resources, right? So you look at Armani. I remember this from the early 2000s. They, were known as a sort of, upscale, sophisticated brand, the Armani suit, right? Mm-hmm. And, the branding on it was always very subtle. And, there were things that would indicate it's an Armani piece. But then they began this sort of subline, this Armani exchange, where now all of a sudden they're selling T-shirts. They might be a $50 T-shirt, $60 T-shirt, and it says Armani Exchange in huge letters, across the chest of the T-shirt. And it's always interesting because, an Armani suit, easily $1,500, $2,000, whatever it is. But now you can associate yourself with this Armani brand for under $100. And now you start seeing these popping up all over the place, these outlet versions of it. And it's interesting to watch that the sort of middle classes clamoring for that kind of thing, clamoring to associate themselves with what they consider to be a higher class thing. But again, like what they're trying to perform into it is this moneyed sort of affluent thing, but then people see them walk around with the Armani T-shirt. They go, "Oh, that's just the Armani T-shirt," and they, there's sort of like this sneer from the upper classes. So it's always interesting watching the cycles of class mobility and what people think is going to be, a means to it. I think that's where it comes back to campuses for me as an educator. I've worked with University of Maryland. I've worked with Columbia College in Chicago, done a little bit of stuff with Emerson, done a little bit of stuff here in California at UCLA. And I'm always interested, especially now, in this trend toward return on investment in consideration of the degrees that are pursued. I'm going to a meetup for my wife's alma mater. I used to be on the board of communications at this school. It's called Stevens Institute of Technology in New Jersey, an engineering school. And they have
actually know it.
Oh yeah, it's a fairly well regarded and a lot of great engineering and solid academics, good place. But they're very centered now on return on investment. These parents, they want to make sure that their kid is going to be employed or employable or upwardly mobile or whatever when they come into it. And I think there are certain guarantees that you just can't put in place when you're considering a degree and a career and whatever that leads to. And I see online a lot, I see people saying, "Oh, I'm in debt so much money. I got a worthless degree. And what I always tell them is I go, unfortunately, even, just a regular bachelor's degree, whatever, concentrations it may be in, that is your entrance. That is your high school diploma. That is the new minimum signifier to enter into these sort of white collar, whatever corporate job of whatever place it might be." And I'm going to be honest with you, the HR departments, they do not care, what your concentration is. You could go in there with a bachelor's degree in philosophy and be hired to do whatever, as long as you have a bachelor's degree. And, that little, tidbit of information seems to blow people's minds because they can't conceptualize, they're like, well, if I'm going to go and I'm going to study, I'm going to get a degree in business or something that, is going to help me pay. It doesn't matter. I mean, if you're going to get a higher concentration, if you're going to go for graduate programs and, perhaps a PhD track, an academic track, like that. I mean, yeah, of course your concentration matters, but really the bachelor's degree has just become the floor.
In many ways, yes. But I think, again, yeah, I mean, you're writing my book here. College is seen as very, very different by different groups of people. Is it voc tech, where you go, you get your degree in X, and then you go get a job in X, and then you make more money? Or is college seen as, preparation to teach you how to learn and think and be semi-independent? Those are interesting questions. I don't know if there are any clear answers. I know my answer is that college is, preparation for go on and get professional education or professional graduate degrees or whatever. But this idea that college is a specific investment puts college into the category of purchase. So if I go buy an overcoat, I want it to do X, Y, and Z, and I want it to be this way, et cetera, and I own it, and I don't have to do any work. Do I have to put it on and tie it? But you don't go and purchase a college degree. You go and purchase the opportunity to sit in classes. Many people often think that, use the purchase metaphor, use the business metaphor, and don't put responsibility on themselves. I am here for you to train me. Okay, that's an interesting thing. An interesting story on campuses. A lot of work has trickled down from upper management down to the deans, down to the department chairs. So fundraising is huge on a lot of campuses because education is very expensive no matter how you do it. So my dean of the College of Education would go out and talk to alumni and essentially the generation of women who were at that point retiring from teaching. And he would do very well in terms of fundraising. The dean of the College of Business would go talk to mostly the men who had their degrees and would get almost no money. And we were sitting around talking about what had happened. And the insight was that those who went to the College of Business saw their college degree as a business exchange. I pay you money, you give me education, I go make money. Thanks very much. It was a purchase. In education, many of these women knew that their 4 years in pre-education majors at our campus transformed their lives. It changed them because in that era, the opportunities for women were nursing and teaching, pretty much. And so they saw campus as a transformative experience for them. They often came out of poverty or came out of non-college going families and were very, very grateful for what had happened. So this, I think, really reflected two quite different paradigms or attitudes or notions of what education is. Let's, go back to your early comments on art, which are just wonderful. What is art? Is art decoration you go behind the couch? Is it an investment? I mean, so many of the Van Goghs that have been bought recently are not on display. They're put in a safe somewhere to increase in value. It's an investment. Okay. I have trouble with that, but it's a different idea of what art should be. Is Banksy art? Yes, no question. Is it different kind of art? Well, it's not old masters paintings. I went to the Prado the Prado Art Museum Gallery about 6 months ago, and then recently went to the National Portrait Gallery in Australia. They're different histories, and the National Portrait Gallery in Australia only goes back 150 years, but such a different celebration of different kinds of peoples. My favorite picture, I took a picture of it, is some typical 50-ish overweight, red-nosed Aussie guy wearing a tank top and hoisting a beer. That's the most Australian picture I can imagine. But from the Prado's perspective, from high art's perspective, this was not high art. Let's have pictures of, men dressed up in armor killing people for Christ. Not particularly my idea of what they should be doing. But the whole idea of college has changed for many people, and college is often marketing itself in that way. When I was still working, there was a nearby college, and they had this, they didn't put it into print, but 4 years and a job was the kind of the mantra they talked up when students were visiting campus. Oh, okay. That's one way to think about it. Another way to think about it is, get your life in order. Schools like Berea College, many of the others who are trying to train people to live in the modern world, and recognize that knowledge has a half-life. By the time you're in the technical fields, it's easily 4 years. So what we teach you as a freshman, half is gone by the time you graduate. So we need to teach you how to think, not the names of all the various different things. At some point, you need to, understand art at a different level rather than, names and dates and when did Degas paint. So those are very different notions. I think that also is one of the divides in the middle class, as higher education as vocational or higher education as developmental. Now, my kids both went to small private liberal arts colleges. Fortunately, I could afford that. They walked out with no debt. And I had no expectation that what they would learn in college, they would use. Now, my son was a political science major, did this and that and the other thing, is now a special education teacher for middle school students. He's found his people. He's great at it. But he also is very active in his union. He was treasurer. He was president. He's now vice president. So the political stuff he did helped him a great deal. So I think it's the way in which we think about post-secondary education really is class-based. Now, teaching in Thailand was fascinating because education is relatively new. Same in China, same in India. In India, there's just not enough spots. In Thailand, the old king, Rama IX, built these Rajabhats, which are basically, state colleges for each of the provinces of, 1 or 2 million. So this is not big, but there's educational opportunity. It was not there in the past. So 70-80% of our students were first generation. 70-80% of our faculty were second or third generation. So you have this very interesting dynamic between those who came from an educated and moneyed family, teaching those who are coming from the village, coming from the outback and whatnot. And that's true in a lot of developing countries. When I was teaching at University of Malaya in Kuala Lumpur, the same thing was happening. Even in the urban centers, our postgraduate students had come from sort of the moneyed class, the professional class. As a quick aside, one of the ways, the standard ways to measure social status is occupational prestige, and there are some charts of what's more prestigious than others. Faculty hate it because we're not number one. Occupational prestige and educational attainment. So New York Times had a big thing 10, 12 years ago, click here, what's your social status? They also included money, which really doesn't help. They would include zip code, which kind of helps a little bit. Oh, wait, zip code is social status oriented? Oh, yes. In the last 30 years, people move into price point neighborhoods. They move to be around people like them. And the marketing people use a zip code and then look at the kinds of features that are going on in there. What do the people buy? How should we advertise to them? Where are we going to sell Architectural Digest, and where are we going to sell Popular Mechanics? So all the marketers know this through their research, and it tends to be private research. But even if you look at colleges, being abroad, somebody says, "Oh, I want to go to college in the U.S." Good. Do you know any? Well, I know Harvard, Yale, and Michigan State. Any of the others? There are 1,500 more. And so the prestige campuses, the Ivy Leagues, Stanford, Michigan State, market themselves widely as a prestige university. All the evidence indicates that it doesn't really matter in terms of learning outcomes where you go. That's a secret. If you want to know more, read the 3 volumes of How College Affects Students.
Mm.
Wonderful, wonderful review of thousands of research articles. But what the difference is who you meet and how you learn the social skills, which goes to social capital. So, the poor first generation student going to an Ivy League school is really out of place, has not a lot of support going on, has a really difficult time. They don't dress right. They don't speak right. They don't eat right. Middle class kid is going on along kind of oblivious, which is a very, very dangerous place to be, unaware of the whole social class dance going on around you. And those from the elite class, the deans call them to make sure they're okay. This is from conversations with friends who came from that strata. And, the poor people in the elite class, it's hard to make new friends because is this new friend after me for my money and prestige? Or is this new friend just like me? Fortunately, I'm old friends with some people who are, I got nothing on them. They got nothing on me. So I don't want anything from them except, we exchange ideas and talk about the histories that we have. But it's very difficult for them to form new friendships because of their name or prestige or perceived prestige and perceived power.
Yeah, I wish. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt. Well,
no, you all your interruptions are fantastic, often better than mine.
I was going to say that I wish that my wife actually could have been able to join us on this call, because this is kind of pertinent to some of the things that she experienced. So when she went to Stevens Institute of Technology, by the time that she had gone there, her grandfather was also part of the alumni, and they have at the school, they have the Wesley J. Howe School of Business. And so, and it's centered in I think it might be the tallest building on campus, big building that got built, in like the late 90s, early 2000s. And, so she's Julia Howe. So she's his granddaughter. So, I mean, just imagine, entering a school and, she got in there. She is very meticulous, academically minded, very, very intelligent person, loves to tinker with things, great mind for engineering. So, she has those gifts and she's going into this school, but at the same time, now entering as a freshman, your grandfather's name is on the tallest building in the school. So, she's described her experiences as very socially isolating because of those reasons that you talked about.
And somehow everyone got to know that she was that Howe.
Exactly.
Not the sewing machine Howe.
Don't know how. She certainly wasn't talking about it, but, people were discussing it.
Yes. That shows up a lot of the issues around cross-class interactions. So for many people, their cross-class interactions are with professionals like physicians or attorneys. That formalized interaction where the expert comes in, you have to defer to the expert, et cetera, creates a certain kind of ritualized relationship. Same class, this is confirming, again, this is the way the world works. You hug, you don't hug, you shake hands, or whatever. But you have the same set of cultural and social skills. Dealing with the famous, the name brand, dealing with the Howes in the Howe building. Although it was a grandfather, so she's, got some distance from that, we would assume. Makes for a very interesting relationship. I'm not immune to that. My in-laws, my daughter's in-laws, daughter's wife's family, nice people, educated people, but the times we've all been together, they put a distance there, I feel, that I would rather not be there. They don't know what to talk about, don't know how to talk, don't know how to behave. These are graduate educated educators, wealthy people, really nice. Nice folks make a good Bloody Mary. That's their family contest, is who can make the best Bloody Marys. But again, these are these cross-class issues are important, cross-class marriages. We know on campus that out-of-class relationships with campus professionals, particularly professors, are incredibly important for students to be successful. And yet, if you have come up only with relationships with attorneys and physicians, you don't know how to talk to regular professors. We had when we were young faculty, there were 6 of us who were kind of starting out together, got together because the only people that age with young kids. And so we had a party. We had very young children, infant children. And we had a couple of students who said, "Hey, can you come, help tend the kids at the party?" And the students who we asked were panicked a little bit. What are they gonna talk about at this party? I don't know if I have anything to contribute, et cetera, et cetera. And they had some trepidation. Well, we ended up, as most academics do, we spent 30 minutes on how should the toilet paper roll hang, overshot or undershot. We all had arguments, and we had physics, and we had, do you own pets, and do you have small children? And they were just aghast at the depth and quality of the discussion of something so mundane. And I said, well, yeah, that's pretty much what we do. We don't talk about, the erudition that we do in our books. So there's these odd perceptions and odd cross-class relationships. I taught for a number of years in a department of counseling. That's happened to be where my stuff was housed. And one of the things we always talked about in helping students, and particularly in those in marriage and family therapy, was cross-class issues. Oddly enough, women will not marry. It is rare for women to marry below themselves in class prestige. So if they're a professional, they're probably not going to be marrying plumbers. Now, I say that because I had a fantastic student. She was really good, getting a PhD in counseling psychology, and her husband was a plumber. Really nice guy. But they're one of the few couples I know that didn't have issues around that. Men often will prefer women from a class below them. I don't know if that's a power issue or what's going on. But as you see these kinds of things happen again and again, then social class issues begin to become issues in the marriage, the relationship. How do you raise kids? Every class has an idea about children that's different, and often enough different to cause child-rearing problems. But for every, let's talk about middle class. There are people who are culturally, socially, economically middle class, but are kind of anti-class, wearing blue jeans to work when everyone else is wearing, whatever, Dockers or maybe even Armani suits. So it becomes an interesting issue the more widely you look at it. But everywhere I have been around the world, we were just for 3 months in Australia and New Zealand, class is very, very visible in terms of this restaurant, upper, lower, middle, this tour, this whatever. You could see class. I mean, just in living in Beijing, I think is the first time I really began to notice the varieties of social class issues. In Budapest, it was the old days when the Iron Curtain was still up. Many of our friends were university friends. So the intelligentsia, which is a class that you find in Europe that you don't find in the U.S. as much, still there. The artists, the poets, the professors, the physicists, still had the intelligentsia in Budapest, still had a group. They knew pretty much each other. They had positions in the Academy of Arts and whatnot. And Elftash Munkash, the good, solid worker, were still the good, solid workers. Although there are always great exceptions. There are the jail to Yale stories, which are great, famous. There's luck and pluck stories from the 20s and 30s in the U.S. And one of our great friends in Budapest, we just saw him a few months ago, had been the bright kid in this small village, but because he came out of the proletariat, the working agrarian class, went to college. Oh. Well, being brilliant really helps. And he moved up, ended up with a car where he had a driver driving him around and whatnot. So there are those stories of class transition that are interesting. And there are stories about social class issues that nobody really wants to talk about where some of these individuals came from.
Mm.
Allen Ginsberg, fabulous poet. I love his poet, Howl. Dude went to Harvard. His father was a stockbroker, and yet he is one of the counterculture's greatest voices of that era. So class works in complex ways.
It does, but
what class are you? I don't know. You tell me. 80% of the American population says, "Well, I'm middle class." Well, no, you're pretty much the ruling class. You got a college degree, which puts you in the top 30% educational. If you've got a graduate degree, it puts you in the top 15% education. If you've got a professional degree or PhD, it puts you in the top 2%. That's not middle class. I don't care. You may not make a lot of money, but that puts you in a very special group. Now, the uber class, people who run things, the uber rich, the ultra rich, are invisible, and they can't be bothered with our lives until it affects their stock portfolios.
Well, what's interesting to me is that it sort of deconstructs this myth that we have in America, this sort of persistent Horatio Alger sort of idea, and it's all kind of tied in with the Protestant work ethic. And in the Horatio Alger stories, the early 20th century, late 19th century kind of motif of, oh, I'm this working class poor kid who has a heart of gold, and I'm honest and forthright, and I'm going to get noticed, and then I'm going to be plucked out by the rich elite, and I'm going to enter that other social class, that other monetary class by way of my industriousness and attitude. And it is a very religiously tied kind of thing. It's a very kingdom of heaven, sort of tale, but I think it's been really internalized, at least here in the US, like a kid who, gets some Pell Grants together, and, a couple student loans, and, whatever else. And they're working a job. Maybe they got some credits at a community college, and they transfer to a state university, and, they're like, okay, well, I'm going to work really, really, really hard and focus on this, and I'm going to get noticed. I'm going to be noticed. I'm going to make sure I'm noticed by my professors, and I'm going to be noticed by these corporations, and I'm going to work, diligently. And that's the metric by which I will be judged. And I feel, unfortunately, like you were talking about Ginsberg and his father being a stockbroker, and, really having the financial freedom to be anti-finance is this weird paradoxical luxury that we have. And, it doesn't always, the industriousness doesn't always translate as a metric for entrance into other social classes. I mean, it's very performance based, almost more so than anything else.
Very, very much so. You touched on a couple of fun issues. One is that money buys you freedom, and I've jotted that down so when I come back to it. But two is that the luck and pluck stories, the Horatio Alger stories, hard work and you'll get ahead. And you still hear this, jail to Yale, poorhouse to Harvard, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Yale and Harvard take a very small number, Stanford, very small number of economically disadvantaged students. You can look all this up on collegenavigator.com, I think it is, might be .org, but College Navigator. But you think of the heroes of the late 19th, early 20th century. So Bruce Willis played some really working class characters who made good. What's the one with the tower and all of that going on?
Oh,
Die Hard.
Die Hard.
Wonderful. In which there was Alan Rickman had the best conversations about men's fashion and suits, because he wasn't talking about Armani. He was talking about the tailor. A bespoke tailored suit is whole different level of thing than Armani. I mean, buy an Armani suit off the rack. Who buys suits off the rack? I mean, really. So anyways, the Bruce Willis had played a lot of really fun working class like people who did very well and killed the bad guy and whatever else. One of the movies, Triple X, these are working class people who are thrown into positions where they have to save the world. And some of those actors are very good, no matter where they came from, are very good at playing underclass individuals. They can do the accent, they can do the attitudes. But so often, the heroes in modern media do come from the underclass and are shown as saving the world. I love the beginning of Triple X, where the very, very sophisticated spy, the first thing is that the 007 light carrier character with the bespoke suits and all the gadgets is killed and then is replaced by Triple X. This is great class commentary that I find amusing. But let's go to this idea that money buys you freedom. Money buys you stuff. Yeah, you can get cool stuff. But most of all, it buys you freedom from worry about disease, freedom of worry about, how much does the guacamole cost on my sandwich, freedom to sit down and write epic poems like Howl. Really, the idea that money buys you freedom is fairly new to many people. Money can buy you stuff and it can buy you experiences. And there's a whole experience economy. All the stuff going on in Orlando, Florida. I'm now physically in South Florida. I can't see the fireworks at Disney from here, but you're never far from Disney if you're living in Florida. The experience economy. But the freedom economy is something very different, which kind of brings up my lifestyle choices. After retiring, sold everything. Everything I own is in a medium-sized suitcase, a rollerboard suitcase, and a very small gym bag. That's all I own. So I've got freedom from needing physical stuff. So if I buy a shirt, I got to get rid of a shirt. If I buy an Armani Exchange t-shirt, I got to get rid of one of my $8 cheap, no label. Well, some of them have labels because they were $8. What do I care? Get rid of stuff. So I have the freedom because I have sort of liquefied my assets enough that I can go spend, June, July, August, September in most of Europe, Edinburgh, Glasgow, Portugal, Berlin, Budapest, Istanbul. A lot of it's visiting friends so I can, sleep on couches. That saves money. But money has afforded me this freedom to go and live this nomadic lifestyle. Delta Airlines likes me because I fly on them a lot. Then, we know. They send me, oh, there's this cruise you want to go on. No, I don't want to go on that cruise. But money and cultural capital buy me a lot of freedom that I would not otherwise have. And I'm not stuck in place. All my friends up in the northern tier states who are getting snowed on, some of them are happy to go skiing, but then they got to come back to a house that they got to heat and have insurance on and all of that stuff that I don't. I am free from worries.
I think there's a paradox that exists. It's unfortunate. I understand why it exists, but it's also, I think, detrimental. So looking again at your example of Ginsberg, maybe we can extrapolate out from there about, this freedom, this idea that if you're insulated from the volatility of wage labor, if I'm not concerned that my job is going to end and I'm going to not know how to put a roof over my head or food on my table, that gives you a lot of time, and it gives you, this ability, this incredible ability to contemplate. You finally, that psychic noise that's happening, that, that constant, animal response about, resources and whatever else. When you're free of that, you have this incredible gift to be able to really think about complex problems, and that may be, a broad, philosophical, kind of inquiry. It could be a very niche, you have this ability of, oh, you know what? I'm really interested in archaeology. I'm going to, deep dive on this less explored aspect of this, civilization, that's wherever, and you go out to, wherever in Mesoamerica, you just devote your time to that because you're not really worried so much about the funding of it. And, you can think. And it's unfortunate that we live in this time where if you have that ability to harness this incredible resource and you're free of these constraints, and you're able to become an expert or part of this intellectual class, the people who are not being able to have that same life and time, that the less burdened by the the electric bill, there is this resentment that you see online, where somebody will say, like, hey, I'm doing this, I'm writing this book, I'm doing this or that or the other thing, and you might see 4, 5, 6, or even sometimes 100 comments reflect back at that. It's like, well, check your privilege, that you think it's so easy for everybody, and blah blah blah. And it's unfortunate that people who decide to devote their time to that kind of inquiry, that kind of betterment of humanity in some ways, right? Like that, hey, nobody else is working on this, I'm going to work on this problem because I got time to do it, are in some ways in at least in the US culture, treated worse than the people who have money and just decide to pursue making more money. And I always wonder about that. I always wonder, because you never see somebody going like, hey, I just bought 5 more apartment buildings, I'm doing this and other. You rarely ever see anybody going, oh, that's such, that's a luxury. That you usually see a lot of comments underneath it going like, oh, good for you, got the hustle, doing this and that, but somebody goes, like, hey, I'm studying this weird esoteric niche, kind of a thing, and I'm looking to interview people about it. Well, are you paying for those interviews, or you do? It's like, oh God,
One of the books that I had as a history major was the Anti-Intellectualism in American Life. That was written in the late 50s, but is still very, very relevant. And intellectuality is associated in very curious ways with social class. But I think you're bang on correct. We see that on threads from time to time, but it's usually, congratulating people. But, I often wonder the writers that I have come to know on threads, do they have a day job, or is this their day job? How did they get the freedom to do this? This is fantastic, because they're doing fun work. But, think about Bertrand Russell, who did some of his best work from jail. He had free time. Isaac Newton, who during the plague invented calculus, and okay, he had freedom. He was wealthy to begin with, but he didn't go out, wasn't distracted.
Oh yeah. Well, even we think of in America, founding father Benjamin Franklin, very industrious, right? The Farmer's Almanac and that sort of BS. I mean, he had nothing but time. He was very well heeled.
Yes, he was a blogger. I remember the line from the play 1776. We're going to Philadelphia, Benjamin. What for? The whoring and the drinking. He pops up and he's ready to go. So there's interclass relationships. Every class has disdain for every other class, but they all want to be the class that's just a little above them. That class striving. So it goes back to the people who are the middle class have maybe a couple of hundred disposable dollars this month, and will buy a name brand purse. But if you get far enough away on the class spectrum, there's a lot of disdain. The people who are poor are, morally reprehensible because they're poor. Poverty is a symptom of something. No, poverty is a symptom of them being crushed by the soul-crushing machine. The rich people, they never did a day of work in their life. Well, some did not, but for the most part, they're regular folks who did well or got in the right place, buy low, sell high. However, but you think about how much vitriol is thrown at Elon Musk and some of the other few capitalists we have left. People just love to hate them. We were in New Zealand, and there were a lot of ambivalent feelings about the people who made and produced the Lord of the Rings and Hobbit movies. Now those people have a louder voice. Everyone's very proud of them because they're Kiwis, et cetera, et cetera. But they've all got this money now, so they're suspect. So somehow money makes you suspect in some people's eyes, and somehow not money makes you suspect in other people's eyes.
Well,
And the poor middle class stuck in the middle. The poor people know they're not getting anything. They're stuck. They're 3 months away from 3 paychecks away from real troubles. The middle class, who think they're temporarily disadvantaged millionaires, don't understand that they're a few paychecks away from trouble, but they're not a few paychecks away from being millionaires.
right.
And this hope is thrown out even to the middle class that if you work hard and get ahead, let's buy cars on time. No, let's buy cars for cash. Then you're not paying 1.5 times the value of the car. Let's, do what you can to pay cash for things. What is it? General Motors discovered that it makes more money lending money to buy cars than it does in selling cars.
Oh yeah, no, that's a well-known this sort of equation. I went to go buy a new car the other day, and my wife and I were talking about it as we went in there because we know there, it's like, all right, well, what's the strategy for this? And when you go to the car lot, you will actually you have to get them to give you the offer letter without ever mentioning that you're paying cash. Never say you're paying cash until like the very last second when they can't back out and change anything, because they're building all their calculations around, this financing thing. They're going to make X amount more on this car. So they'll give you a better deal. If you walk into the dealership and say, hey, I'm here to buy a car today. I've got cash in my pocket and I'm ready to roll off the lot. You're going to get a much worse deal because they don't think that they're going to get that extra, maybe even twice as much of the value of the car, whatever they give you, because of the financing. And it's interesting, you mentioned earlier about the airline. If you look into this, airlines nowadays, the actual business of travel is a loss leader for them for their credit card business. Their credit card business is actually where their profit center is.
Cool. I did not know that. I have a Delta credit card, but it gets me into, I figured it comes out about even for the advantages I get and for what I pay for it, but that's absolutely fascinating. So credit card debt is just incredible in this country. Credit card debt, from a class perspective, pay for class privilege now and buy class privilege now, your Birkenstock bag or whatever, Birkin bag, pay later.
Yep.
So a lot of people get into such debt, but the world works in mysterious ways. So I have long-standing arguments with, how do newspapers make money? How do TVs make money? How does social media make money? Your eyeballs are sold to advertisers. I am a market share. I've moved from Chrome to Firefox as Chrome became more and more commercial. I'm moving from Firefox to one of the other new ones because, it's more concerned about Brave. It's more concerned about my privacy. I'm less of a market share.
Right.
But on the other hand, I just find ads annoying. I don't buy that stuff anyway.
So let's say that somebody is a high school student who's, again, from like maybe, I really hate these words, and I know that there's no way to have the conversation without them, but like, we'll say like lower middle class, right? I know these, it is what it is. And they're going to be college bound. Again, not any especially prestigious school, maybe a state school or whatever their situation is that they're getting into, but they want to have some kind of, or at least, their family is putting them through this for some kind of opportunity. I mean, if you were going to have like a sit down, if this is a family friend and they say, hey, talk to my kid about, how to get the most out of this for upward social mobility. I mean, what would you even say to that person as they're entering that environment?
I suspect somehow I'm slipping you psychic images of the questions to ask. So good. I have a blog. I finished writing a book on social class on campus by the same name. Just started writing the blog as I had additional thoughts. And 2 of the highest hit, about 350 50,000 people or something have viewed at least one of the pages. I don't advertise it. I don't do anything. I don't know what I'm doing. But the two of the most popular pages is, how do I change my social class? And the first thing I say is, are you sure you want to, or do you want to transclass or code switch? Because kid goes off to college, learns his new behaviors, new ways to think, new views on the world, new views on whatnot. And the phrase comes up, they get above their raising. Families often are mean to kids who go off to college and get affected. But so that's an important caveat. College does change you. There's nothing you can do about that. You can just not go. But the simple answer, the very straightforward answer, is get involved. Join this club, join that club, talk to your professors outside of class, go up to them after class, ask questions, or seek clarification, but just get involved. I've got data on about 240,000 college students. We're looking at learning outcomes and the factors that led to learning outcomes. And the easy conclusion is, it's the relationship. Building relationships outside of class with others, particularly grown-ups, the professors, faculty, advisors, the support staff, is absolutely central. Now, in terms of social class stuff, there's all kinds of cool things you can do about learning to dress and presentation of self and other things like that. But to get the most out of college is become engaged. And I'm very proud of both of my children. I tell the story about my daughter, who was getting a master's in public policy at UCLA. She had been working for Lambda Legal and wanted to sit at the grown-ups table. So let's go get a degree in public policy. So one of her professors teaching politics of Los Angeles had run for president of the United States at some point. Okay, cool. That's somebody fun to have for a professor. So at the end of the first class, my daughter goes down through the steps in the arena, up to the front desk, and chats him up, saying, oh, hey, you were in Massachusetts, I was in Massachusetts, and builds this relationship because she's got these social skills, because she's not afraid to do these kinds of things, and had a great time, a great semester. I doubt that it affected her grade, but when she had questions, she could go get involved and engaged with him. And I'm sure, as former candidate for the president of the United States, he's got a lot of friends who can help. But for some high school kid, get involved. Don't lose yourself. If college requires you to write or speak in a different register or a different way or a different voice, go with that, but don't lose your own. And that's absolutely critical. College can overwhelm an individual, and you take on all these attributes of a class that's not authentic to you. And it can mess with your head. It can be a very difficult experience. If you're a churchgoer, go to the local church, join the students group at that church. Ways to get support, ways to get exposure, but get involved. Now, that works for every student. On the other hand, my kids knew that. When my son graduated from college, as he's walking across the stage, the president stood up of his college, not Obama. The president of his college stood up and hugged him as he went across the stage, because he built that relationship over the 4 years he was at campus. Relationships are social capital that can turn into all kinds of things. But those are skills you can build. There are interpersonal skill building workshops. I've attended many, try to teach people how to shake hands. That goes for class, that goes across ethnicities, the whole handshaking business, and very interesting from African-American perspectives, or gender perspectives. I tried to teach a lot of women how to shake hands in the man's world. You choose to do what you want to do, but, the reality is shaking hands in a lot of businesses. So you were in the entertainment business. Was it a handshaking business or not?
We're turned more into like a fist bumping business. Is again, social class is always a moving target, right? So now you look at that and you go, okay, well, people are a little bit more germophobic, so it's like a fist bump became kind of the better handshake. It was still a gesture, but it was more about respecting, the personal space. All these unwritten rules are how they can drive somebody absolutely insane, and they're constantly changing, and you have to be cognizant of them. And I think that's probably something that I would say to a young person, who's looking to gain some level of change in social class, is to become very well studied in behaviors. Watch people, watch not just how they speak, but watch, the physicality, and always be able to be willing to make adjustments if you feel that they're necessary. If that's your goal, I'm not here to tell anybody that one is better than the other. It's just, these are the things that sometimes people want,
If you want to fit again, I'm slipping you cards under the desk to ask me these questions. Living in different cultures, I'm pretty good as a cultural anthropologist. Moving to Thailand is not a touch culture. It's a Y culture, but trying to understand the rules of who bows first to who. A Y is you put your hands together, kind of up to your nose, and just like bow. But it took me a long time to figure out, you have to bow, who does it to who, et cetera, et cetera. And only through observing can you learn these things. Moved from there to Malaysia, where any formal transaction, whether I'm buying something or getting change, is a two-handed gesture where your right hand goes out to get it and your left hand supports your wrist or forearm. I'd been there there were 6 Fulbright students who just finished their degrees in the U.S. 5 were going into medicine. So they were doing a year in Kuala Lumpur, courtesy of Fulbright. Brilliant kids. After a while, I said, I notice you're not doing this with your hand. And they said, what? I said, haven't you been watching the world around you? And they went, So we had a long conversation about culturally observing. And I think you bang on correct, and I'm embarrassed that I did not mention, just watch. The interpersonal distance is different by classes. Touch. There are ways that you can establish dominance. I'm 6 feet tall. I got a big beard. I can assert dominance over a lot of men, and they don't quite understand that it's happening. And I think it's really pretty funny because I'm kind of a dick sometimes if they deserve it. Where can you touch people, et cetera, are all part of social class issues. But just watch, and you can watch on TV. You can watch on TV shows, although they're fairly fictional. They really don't get at class issues. The hero is not supposed to. Yeah,
and these skills, these social rituals, and how to implement them, the ability to quickly observe and and assess and implement. There's a little bit of a dark side to that too, and that gets into like social engineering and social hacking and all those sort of things. So I mean, it's a skill that some people do develop, to a high degree, and it is something that can be learned, and it is something that can be replicated. But Will, I think we're kind of coming up on the end of our time. Hey, 2 things.
Before you close out, I just want to say the talented Mr. Ripley.
Exactly. Yeah. If you haven't seen that film in the audience, it's a really, really great film, great book that it's based on. And also there's another adaptation, I think from the late 60s or 70s called Purple Noon. The European film is very good.
Great. Oh, I have just been so thrilled with your questions and an opportunity to chat with you. Keep going.
Oh, absolutely. This has been wonderful for me too. What would you leave the audience with as a final thought? And also, where can they find more about your books, your work, and your travel?
Final word or thought. I'm flashing to the Keanu Reeves answer for, what happens after people die. Incredibly profound and wonderful. Watch and learn. I mean, I'm going to steal from your conclusion there. I think, pay attention. Yeah, if people are arguing about art, ask yourself, how does class play into these perceptions, and how does class play into how these people are relating to each other? When you're choosing a university to go to, how does class play into this? If you don't understand about universities the way I do, I mean, after 30 years as a professor of higher education, The the rankings for universities will help you, but watch and listen and learn. The absolute best things you can do. And really try not to be judgmental. If somebody's a very different social class from you, pay attention and honor that. I think that's incredibly important. I mean, you're coming out of the high prestige movie business, which we all think of as the stars and whatnot. Here we are, the bit part players. Well, that idea of stars and bit part players is probably not the best way to think of the world. I mean, ask yourself about how you see the world. So yeah, watch what's going on around you, watch how you're being in the world, and take care of your own performance. How can you find me? Social Class on Campus, all one word. And you can find my sometimes scintillating blog, sometimes not. But 350,000 people have found something in there worth reading.
And I hope we can add a couple more to that. It's been such a pleasure, Will. I really appreciate you taking the time and coming on.
Ask me again and I'll say yes. You're fun. And clever, and et cetera, et cetera. I was listening to your dialect of English, and I go, this dude's educated.
Visit phantomastronaut.com for all of the different ways that you can help us to continue to create. And I will see you out there.